Hello Church, Pastor Stephen from Renfrew Christian Fellowship here. Today we're going to do part 5 of Good Things to Dwell Upon. And as we're looking at these good things to dwell upon, there are sometimes practical things that we can do, like praying and worshipping, that we find ourselves in the presence of God. I remember many years ago talking to someone and couldn't understand, I was a churchgoer, couldn't understand about this big deal about the presence of God. What was the big deal about being in the presence of God? Surely going to work, going to church and singing songs and prayers was more than enough. Yet there was so much more. There was aspects of a relationship with God that were there, but they were missing from that person's life. And I pray that they have found that. So what's the big deal about worship? And what's the big deal about spending time in God's presence? The final chapter of the book that I wrote, Why We Worship, the Reason for Our Song, covers this. And I'm going to read chapter 11 to you today. So it's a good thing to dwell upon. It is a good thing to dwell upon, worship in God's presence. And I pray that this gives you food for thought today. Chapter 11, Worship and God's Presence. What's the big deal anyway? Why is God's presence so important? Isaiah 57 verse 15 says this, For thus says the high and lofty one who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place with him who has a contrite and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble, and to revive the heart of the contrite ones. From the moment man stepped out of God's presence in the Garden of Eden, getting back in has been the running story throughout the Old and New Testament. The built-in desire to worship and adore is evident in every heart. From life's first cry to our final breath, we have a deep longing. It's foundational, it's historical, and it's not going away. In this final chapter, we shall look at the presence of God then and now, and hopefully shall have a closer walk with God. You shall have a closer walk with God through it. I believe we've all been given access to the very throne room of God himself, the one who gave breath and life to Adam, the one who called you by name, the one who spoke the universe into being, the one who went to the cross for you. This is our God. This is the same God, the one who walked and talked with man in the beginning. He walks and talks with us here today. The advent of anything is, of course, the beginning. The advent of Christ is the annual celebration of the birth of Jesus, and we've placed it on December the 25th. This is, of course, not Jesus' birthday. Greater minds than I have narrowed it down to somewhere between September and December. The point, of course, being the advent of Christ is to prepare us, to get our focus fully on the one who came for us, and not to the commercialism of the season that has long since overtaken the day. The advent of sin, which we walk in if we have breath, is a narrative of the human story in which we draw. From this very moment, the sin moment, our relationship with God had diminished. Indulge me for a moment. Let's go back to the Garden of Eden and walk with our Creator. Imagine this. The soft grass underfoot was wet with the dew of the morning. The air was filled with the sound of 1,000 sweet birds cawing and chirping as the golden sun rose upon the fresh new day. Adam walked to the stream. He bent down and placed his hand in the cool waters. He drew a long and satisfying drink from the waters. The fish swam below him. They did not stir or dart away. The first man rose to continued to explore. The branches parted like a curtain before him. His eyes beheld the glory of creation as it unfurled from God's lips. The earth had settled into rolling hills and open plains, Creatures walked the earth eating grasses and herbs. He plucked some fruit from a nearby branch and continued to walk as he ate. Adam smiled. He heard footsteps. It had been another beautiful day, as the setting sun coloured the distant sky with fresh hues of orange and red. Adam heard a familiar voice. Behold, I make all things new. God and Adam continue in conversation. How has your day been? What did you do today? Tell me what you saw. I could go on, but I think you get the idea. All was well. The garden indeed was rosy. Adam wanted to share this, and God was not surprised. Eve was created as a companion for Adam, and they explored the garden together. Later, it all gets messy. The advent of sin, the perfection of creation spoiled by a lying serpent, misunderstandings about who God was had begun. Genesis 3 and 8, Adam and Eve hid from the presence of God. From that point on, we have been hiding from God. Genesis 4 verse 23, God sends Adam out of the garden, therefore out of God's presence, and from that point on we have been lost. Thankfully, God made a way through Jesus Christ, and we can come back. In Exodus 28 verse 1, we see the lineage of priests and sons. Aaron is made priest to minister before God, so the priestly access to God begins. And this starts off well enough. And then in Exodus chapter 32, Moses is called up the mountain to speak with God. He's somewhat delayed, as we know. The people get restless and demand another God to worship. And even when it's not right, even when it's not true, the desire to worship is now truly set in our hearts. It seeks an outlet. It seeks a way to be gratified. The desire for presence is deep. The longing is misunderstood. Aaron is persuaded that making an idol will be sufficient and not offensive. In the absence of Moses' wisdom and command, he fails. The fall continues. The advent of the law is at hand. Only Moses could approach. Exodus 24 verse 2. In this we find God's desire to be present with us, yet because of sin, the gulf between God and man is firmly set in place. Sacrifice must be made on behalf of the people to cleanse them for their impurities. Only Moses can approach God on the people's behalf. He pleads with God. We will not go unless you're with us. Such is his revelation and experience of God's presence. Moses knows life will merely be existence without the presence of God. It's not until Exodus chapter 33 verse 14 that we hear God say to Moses, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Moses had found grace and favour with God. As the journey in search for the presence of God continues, the children of Israel find themselves with a requirement that must be met. Just one, I hear you say? As we're studying worship here, the perspective we're coming from is the same: the desire to restore and be restored. The desire of God to bring us back into his presence, and the desire of man to journey home to God. The requirement of the law at this stage is this: there is a prescribed place to worship. A command in place that you can only worship where God says. Deuteronomy 12 verse 5, "But you shall seek the place where the Lord your God chooses." There is no doubt that God is setting out the requirements of the law. Are the chosen ones being punished? Well, certainly the law is described as a curse of sin and death. Romans 8 verse 2. It is unattainable. Yet God does not withhold his presence from man. He sets boundaries and requirements. All the while, a scarlet thread is being woven through the tapestry of history. And when we step back and look at the bigger picture, we see the beauty of God's plan. The Israelites, of course, could not see it at the time. Sounds familiar? We still struggle to see the bigger picture of God's plan in our lives. This is why we must step back occasionally and trust God to be God in our lives. This is why we need to be still. The presence of God is sought and life goes on. Tents are erected, sacrifice is made, sin is committed, sin is forgiven. God is with his people, distant yet present. Time marches on. For the children of Israel, generations of life and death have come and gone. Judges have ruled and now kings are reigning. Let's focus our reign on King David for a moment. Spoken of as a man after God's own heart, David knew that there was joy to be found in God's presence. The presence of God was found in the temple of God. God chose to dwell in between the cherubim on the mercy seat. Exodus 25 verse 22. This is where he would speak to Moses, and this is where he would speak to David. The Ark of the Covenant, the promise, was, as we know, housed in the temple. God's presence was moved under strict guidelines from place to place. This, of course, was the subject of many wars, and the presence of God, when carried correctly, was the defining characteristic of the victorious. The presence of God was sought after by the Philistines, albeit for the wrong reasons. When the ark was brought to Jerusalem, David sought to place the ark back where it belonged in the temple of God built by Solomon. Having gathered 30,000 of his best men and commissioned a new cart to carry the ark on, King David was convinced he was on the right route. He was, after all, returning the ark to Jerusalem. What could possibly go wrong? David had, of course, failed to follow the requirements of the law. In his haste to regain God's presence, he forsook the law. The Philistines had placed the ark on a cart. David thought a new one would have been more appropriate. And we read in 2 Samuel 6 verse 7 that God's anger was aroused, and he struck Uzzah, who was steadying the ark. The oxen pulling the ark had stumbled. Enter the contrite heart. The lesson that David learned here would stay with him all his days. The house of Obed-Edom was to be the resting place of God's presence until David got his heart right. 3 months passed, and the family of Obed-Edom were all blessed by God during that time. I'm sure David was watching all the goings-on during his heart-searching time out. Just as an aside, when you are displaced for a time through illness or circumstance, off book now, like just now, this is us being displaced for a time due to circumstance. Do you realign your heart with God? I often do. I may, like Jacob, wrestle with God for a day or two, then give in, rest, and listen. And that's where instruction is given. Having seen the right way to return the ark, David arranges the poles and the sons of Kohath, and then celebrates as they return. 6 steps and worship. I believe this sets up the precedence for sung worship that we are encouraged to offer up this day. Hebrews 13 verse 14 says, "Therefore by him let us continually offer up the sacrifice of praise to God, that is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name." King David, of course, is famed for his wee dance in his pyjamas. This linen ephod or undergarment would often have been slept in, hence the connection. Upon his return, Michal, David's wife, had plenty to say to him. She felt that he had exposed himself in his being jubilant. The famed reply, of course, says that, "Therefore I will play music before the Lord, and I will become even more undignified than this." 2 Samuel 6 verse 21. Even so, in the Old Testament, the presence of God was a huge deal. David knew that in God's presence there was fullness of joy. Psalms 16 verse 11. He knew, like Moses, that life was mere existence without the presence of the giver of life. Our own modern worship journey is, of course, a mixture of all these things. We have the reverence of the holy God on the holy mountain. We are awestruck by the one who parted the Red Sea, spoke creation into being, and breathes life into us. Our worship journey, our search for God's presence, finds its conclusion in Jesus Christ. The scarlet thread that runs through the Old Testament and Psalms is, of course, the prophecy of the coming Messiah. He is the reason that we can enter into the presence of God without a priest, without a blood sacrifice. We are now seen as righteous in the sight of God because of the death of Jesus on the cross. We are risen and reigning with him in heavenly places because of his resurrection, and we have the hope of his soon return. God's presence today is accessible to all who will confess the name of Jesus as Lord. As we approach the living God in our song worship, we have the inexpressible honour of entering in freely. We can approach not of ourselves, not of anything that we have done, but because of everything that Jesus has done. Jesus made a way into God's presence. In the temple, this was called the most holy place. Behind the second curtain was a room where only the priests could go. The Ark of the Covenant would sit there. God would dwell in between the two cherubim on the mercy seat. Oh, the wonder of it all. You and I can draw near. Do you get it? Are you awestruck yet? There's no more need for a high priest or an intermediary, someone who goes there on your behalf, who goes there before you. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Hebrews 4, verses 14 to 16. I never want to lose the wonder of this. It's my earnest prayer before the Father that you too will be awestruck by the awesomeness of God. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. James 4, verse 8. Notice that James, the writer here, says, draw near, come in, don't sit back over there. This is an invitation like no other. You and I are home. We're home, invited in. The table is set and the host is in the room. We have an open invitation to join the King of creation, to sit with him, to come aside and draw near. Just to be present in his presence is enough. But in his love and mercy, he chooses to bestow gifts upon us, giving us joy unspeakable, peace, perfect peace, love beyond measure, and mercy so free. Before Jesus, the priest used to have bells tied round one ankle and a rope to the other, so that if they died in God's presence, they could pull him out and not need to go in themselves. And it shall be upon Aaron when he ministers, and its sound will be heard when he goes into the holy place before the Lord, and when he comes out, that he may not die. Exodus 28, verse 35. This is where we need to grasp it. If you haven't got it by now, you may never grasp it, but I pray that you do. We can draw near and not die. Jesus died for us. He took our sin. We now have right standing before God. That's what righteousness is. We will not die in the presence of God. We will live. The thief does not come except to steal, to kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life, and that they may have life more abundantly. John 10:10. This is truly life in abundance. The overwhelming urge to worship him must be filling you now. I've had to stop and worship him as I write this. Take a few minutes now and love God for what he has done for you. In conclusion, dear friends, the presence of God is everything. The daily life, as Moses and King David and all the other saints of old would testify, would merely be existence without his presence. So, as we live and express our gratitude, as we engage with others, as we sing our worship to the only one who has called us by name and saved us, let us do so with delight and awe until he returns or go to be with him. This is the reason for our song. This is why we worship. This is the reason for our song. I know it's longer today, and I pray that you do have time to sit 20 minutes and just have a time with this and listen. Bless you. Spend time in God's presence today. Spend time and worship him and honour him. And know that you can draw near. Be blessed. Stay safe. Bye for now.